to cover the global tech story, and appreciate being up here with these two great speakers to talk about AI. The title here being AI for Good, and Steve, you touched a little bit on a couple of the themes. Can you give any further examples of like, what is AI for good? I mean, how has AI to date done, good, quote, in however you want to define that, and if we could leave aside the medical applications, because those are quite specialized applications, and so I'm interested in kind of broader ways in which AI kind of touches people in a positive way.
I think right now it's already pervasive, so anybody that's already using something around any of the voice assisting tools, you can talk about the importance or impact of an Amazon or an Uber or any other convenience. I don't know whether that would be for good, but for sure those would be examples of widespread, pervasive AI. When people say someday we might work for robots, the answer is Uber drivers already do, or Grab drivers already do. There isn't a human being sitting in there dispatching every single vehicle. Those are algorithms. So good things can come from that. But if we take it another level and we talk about public safety, certainly things like facial recognition in airports, I would argue, is a good example of AI for good, because we want to try and keep bad people out of places where they could cause harm to others. And so even though there's a debate about facial recognition being a dark side, I argue everybody in this room wants security at an airport or a public facility and for that to be used. So I think it's widespread, and I would argue that those are always AI for good because they're helping people. Education. China, as you'll know, is one of the world leaders in experimenting with the deployment of AI to personalize learning, and I think that's a great leadership example of how AI could be used to improve quality of education and success of education, and I admire China for wanting to experiment with that. I think that's another example of AI for good.
So just to be a little contrarian here, you raise two good examples. I think in the case of education, there's currently a big backlash in the U.S. Over computerized education, essentially, that it's used as a kind of a cost-cutting thing on the one hand, and a profit generator for the companies on the other hand, but it actually doesn't really do much for students. And so in fact, on the contrary, that students don't want to be taught by an algorithm; they want to be taught by a person. And there's a lot of arguments to be that people are better teachers than algorithms. So how do we assess that? Like, what's the framework to say, well, actually, this kind of AI-driven educational system is not really good, except maybe for the people who sell it.
Yeah, I mean, to me, and I'll try and be brief on this, to me, there's never a binary, this is or this is not. What I'd like to put forward is a belief that AI is a complementary tool. Let me illustrate the point. My eldest girl is a grinder. She learns based on spending hours and hours and hours going over something. My son is more of an experimentalist and free thinker. It would have been great for them when they were going through different stages of school if that learning could have been molded and provided to them by a human. So I still want that human intervention or human contact, but the idea that you have 20 kids sitting in a room and then you have one push, and kids learn in different ways. So I'm a believer, just as there's personal medicine and personal fashion and personal food, why ought there not to be more personal learning? So I don't mean give a kid a laptop and then say, take the exam. I'm asking for understanding neurolinguistic and the learning patterns of kids in order to make sure that the teacher is understanding how to interact with them in a different way.
The second example you cited with facial recognition and public safety, and I'd like to put this question to Richard. There is a quite interesting debate right now, specifically around that, because everyone wants public safety, but what level of surveillance and intrusion on you as a person are you going to accept in exchange for public safety? And there's a big kind of cultural divide on this. If you ask people in China, they'll say, well, yeah, the safety aspects are great, and we don't really care about the privacy aspects. But in the United States, it's not really the same discussion. And so my question is, what is the sort of mechanism for working out that conflict between, essentially, between personal privacy and autonomy and safety? Because if there's no mechanism, then it'll just be rolled out, without really consideration for the privacy aspects. So there has to be kind of some way of adjudicating that, and Microsoft, I think, is one of the companies that's kind of in the teeth of that problem right now. So what should that sort of trade-off resolution mechanism look like?
That's a very, very interesting question, Jonathan. I think when you think about facial recognition itself, and our chief legal counsel have come up really strongly about it's something that governments around the world should really consider about regulating itself. But the way I like to kind of look at that, it's also not just the technology itself, but really the humans behind the technology, the companies, the organizations, and the teams that are implementing or thinking about deploying the technology into society itself. A lot of times, what I like to share with business leaders is that when we think about putting our teams together, the various team members, the leaders, we look for cognitive intelligence, we look for emotional intelligence in these folks, right? But I think there's that third element around moral intelligence of a person or of a team when they come together to work on something as complex as complex as artificial intelligence itself and the implications to society and to human rights like privacy, for example. So I think that's always that balance that organizations and leaders need to just think about. It's not really about just the brightest scientists behind that, but really what's the moral compass of the team when they think about deploying such technologies into society and the potential of it being abused, knowing that that's a potential fact, and how this policies get put in place, checks and balances be put in place, so that there is enough checks and balances across the ecosystem itself, not just the technology itself, but also the people behind it. I think that's the element that we as humans can come into play when we think about a kind of technology like facial recognition.
And so within Microsoft, is there any way that idea is institutionalized? Are there cases, and I would put this to Steve too in a different context, but are there cases where you would say to a customer or even to a kind of internal customer, would you say, no, don't do that. Like that really is over the line ethically. Do those situations come up, and how do you, those are tricky calls, right? So how do you, what's the mechanism for those calls?
Yeah, that's great. We do have a mechanism. Short answer is yes. A couple of years ago, across the organization, we formed a ethics committee. This was a cross-functional set of folks, not just from research, but from engineering, but from businesses across the board. This is the ITER committee. You can read about it online as well. But at the same time, what we did was we designed subsets of principles to engender trust when we think about selling or building artificial intelligence technology itself, whether it's around reliability and safety, whether it's around fairness, whether it's around bias. all of that is enshrined within the 6 principles that we have, and I'll talk a little bit about that when I engage with business leaders here. And what that has proliferated throughout the company in Microsoft is that we have had people appointed, or let's say in some ways trained and sensitized to these principles across the company, even in the sales arena, for example. So I sit on a responsible technology council within the organization itself, and when we look at potential customer deals that are using our AI technologies, we do want to ensure in some certain form or factor that it is for responsible use and it's not going to be abused. So it's a very tricky line, and we're still navigating through that experiences and mechanism, if you will, but I think we are learning a lot in the way we have those conversations with our customers, with our partners, but also internally within Microsoft as well. So I think that's been a very good learning journey for us, and we'll continue to do so because customers are leveraging our technology. And when we think about that, we really want to know that they are also leveraging it for the betterment of society, the betterment of their businesses or things like that. So this has become a lot more institutionalized within the company right now, and we're sharing that quite a fair bit with the community that we engage here, for example.
Stephen, in terms of either funding companies or advising companies that you fund, do you have a way of kind of reviewing the ethical soundness of what people are doing?
We take a lot of reference from what's already available. I mean, PDPA here, the Personal Data Protection Act, gives a framework. The Government Instruction Manual gives a framework. So there's lots of frameworks already in Singapore and in other countries. There are equivalents around personal data protection, primarily business to consumer, not so much business to business. But I met with an entrepreneur yesterday who said, I would like to build a facial recognition team that then is focusing on enhancing shopping experience. And he said, wouldn't it be amazing, because everybody knows you get geo-fenced, like if you're walking through 313 or the ION and you go past a certain store, sometimes you can get a ping saying, there's a 5% offering in this particular place. He wants to do that for facial recognition. So when you're walking around the mall, the idea is it says, this is Steve or this is Richard, and I know that Richard likes these things, and I'm going to make sure that Richard is incentivized to stop in at this store for this particular offering. And my question to him was, that sounds pretty scary to me. There's two things in my world. Facial recognition is either security enhancing or convenience enhancing, and he wanted to play it to the convenience enhancing side. And he has lots of retailers that, not surprisingly, said, boy, if you build this, we'll be a customer. My question to him was, go check with the PDPC, the commission that oversees the Data Protection Act. Go get some legal advice. Go check some other areas, and he's working on it, and then let me know where you stand. So it's not our role to be a moral judge, but it is to say we won't invest in it, we don't know others that would invest in it, and we think you're going to have a tough time with adoption unless you take these questions head on. So that would be an example where already facial recognition is moving into daily life and out of security services portfolio.
So you are kind of being a moral judge, right? I mean, if you say we're not going to invest in it, that's
because we don't think that there would necessarily be a viable business. What we don't want to try and do is say, you ought not to ever use any technology like this because we don't feel good about it. Back to your point about cultural, may be amazing in market one and not amazing in market two. I don't want my bias. If we talk about having unbiased AI, which both Richard and I try and think about, unbiased AI, then I cannot be biased in my view. What I would say is that business is not going to succeed, and therefore there isn't something which represents an opportunity for us to participate. I tend not to say, I'd love to be a part of your business, but I don't feel good about it from an ESG, right? Ethics and sustainability and governance. So we try to look at it from, are we enabling an entrepreneur? Now, clearly, if they said I want to engage in weapons of mass destruction or chemicals, or there are boundaries, but I don't know that facial recognition isn't widely accepted by any particular population, because if we've traded a lot of our data to get convenience from Amazon, is it a logical step to say when I walk through the mall, I'd like people to ping me with special advertising? There's some number of people in the population that would say, count me in which case then I'd argue to him, have an opt-in, opt-out policy. You couldn't scan everybody and then say every human being that walks into the ION will get something. That's not ethical. So I try not to put myself in that position, but instead approach it from, here's 3 questions that I would think about if I were in your shoes, and then we can have another conversation.
And that's the great thing. I'd just like to jump in here, Jonathan. It's starting that conversation to the entrepreneur to really think about not just the technology itself, but really some of the implications that it can bring. And I think that's that kind of discussion, that's that kind of conversations.
Do you think there's a, we're all kind of old guys up here, but is there a generational component to the concerns about this? And you can think about that in 2 different ways. So on the one hand, I think younger people tend to be generically more comfortable with new technology, less hand-wringing about the possible consequences. But on the other hand, there is it's certainly true in Silicon Valley right now, where a lot of younger employees of big tech companies are really demanding that the companies, Microsoft included, that the companies do a lot more on the ESG front, as to use the acronym there. So that generational thing maybe plays both ways, and I'm just curious if either of you have observed that kind of divide in how people are responding to AI and other types of very advanced technology.
Yeah, I mean, how many people are afraid to use a train? How many people are afraid to use an elevator? Nobody. But when the lift or the elevator was introduced, it was a source of great anxiety. And a chap named Otis, who developed brakes that if the lift were to unexpectedly drop, would clamp onto the rails and prevent a catastrophe. And of course, you'll know the name Otis in lifts now. So every technology goes through, it's new, people are fearful. As it becomes more mainstream, anxiety reduces. And as far as I'm concerned, with my 15-year-old as a proxy, she becomes annoyed if Alexa does not understand her instruction in the first speaking. And my point to her is, 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, that wasn't even a method of meaningful interaction. So in 5 or 6 or 7 years, as the vocabulary increases and learning increases, so she sees that as a very normal thing. She's only frustrated by the level of accuracy that it currently has, but that's going to change in orders of magnitude in the years ahead. So my answer is, I don't know that it's young versus less young. I just think that tech goes through this period of anxiety and unfamiliarity, and then it becomes familiar, and then everybody said, what was the big deal?
Yeah, it's a great point. I think it's also reflected in a book I was recently reading called Innovation and Its Enemies, on how when innovation first came about, we all really like it to look like the previous innovation, so that we don't fear it. But I think that's a very important thing. When we think about the different generations of folks that's entering the workforce, and I got interviewed recently by one of our interns, and she was just asking a question about, hey, how should I gain credibility with my seniors at work and things like that. And I paused her for a little bit just to say, the context that we grew up in our workplace and access to information and the style and technology was very different from your time right now in terms of access to information and style and all of that. It's very hard for me to just impose my way of thinking and my approach or definition of success to you. So I think, like what Steve said, is that whole continuum that is very different. And yet I think we as let's say the older adults of the industry should really think about not just about imposing our definition of how we should think about this, but really having that conversation on and understanding of what the experiences and the context that they come from, and the context that they come from. And when we learn from each other, I think there will be some magic in there.
And just one last question, is slightly different aspect of the point, but in the survey you showed customer engagement as being a top usage of AI, and certainly the voice interaction. I understand that piece of it. But one thing I don't understand is a couple of main interactions. So I'm a DBS Bank customer and I'm a Singtel subscriber, and when I go on their website, they have this chat bot, which is supposedly an AI chat bot, and it's going to answer my questions. So that chat bot can never, ever answer a question. The only thing it can answer is a simple search query, essentially, and everything else, it's like, forget it, So I'm not really seeing it in terms of, AI as a customer engagement improvement. So just curious as to your thoughts as to kind of, sure, I mean, it'll get better, but it seems to be quite far off. And so I just wonder, in terms of the here and now, when people talk about customer engagement, what does that really mean? Because, you also reference, like, you don't want it to degrade your dignity, and it kind of degrades my dignity a little bit with that stupid chatbot, So where are we going to kind of see it being helpful, and in what realms and how quickly?
Okay, I gotta be careful there because both of them are my customers. but I think it comes back to if you recall the presentation I shared earlier around tech intensity. So I think some of these interactions and some of these early attempts at bots are still kind of based on prior technologies and capabilities, if you will. And the way to think about it is that it's not just the use of the technology itself, but really thinking about how does that augment together with the humans that's behind it. And when you think about not just the adoption, but also the capabilities of the workforce itself, how are they bringing the workforce into that chatbot experience? If there is a sensibility that, hey, Jonathan is not getting a very good experience just interacting with my bot at that point in time, is there a human that can jump in right away and say, hey, Jonathan, it's me, I'm really human, and we're still working on improving our bot. We'd love to work with you.
The hack of those bots is to say into the bot, I want to speak to a person.
But I think that's I think it's still an evolution. It's still a journey itself, and I think that organizations that are implementing these technologies cannot simply just think of, hey, that's the way I reduce my customer support personnel. I think that's the wrong way to think about it. They should really think about, I've got this bot that can answer some of the easy questions, but when I have a more complex customer with very sophisticated needs to address, then I should put my best foot forward in terms of that customer engagement. And that's when the human steps in.
Quick response is that all these things will continue to evolve, so I think it's unfair to say this is an example of where it's frustrating. I think it will always improve, and I understand and agree that chatbots, like other tech, is still on this journey. It's so early. I think the other thing that you'd want to highlight in terms of where we have come to rely on tech unknowingly is, like this evening I'm flying to London. We all know that apart from a relatively few number of minutes, the 14-hour flight will be controlled by a machine or machines or intelligence. Importantly, I think there's an opportunity for that to keep us more safe. So again, I'm very biased in terms of tech optimism. But recently landing at a city in Europe when there was stormy conditions, the pilot came on and said, this is now not something that I feel is for me, right? I mean, he phrased it more elegantly, but basically said, I'm engaging auto land system. So the plane and the airport are going to talk to each other. So I'm here if I need to jump back in, but essentially it's not autopilot, it's auto land. Pilots always land, but in this particular case, he said this one, because of the conditions, I'm more confident for us to do that through the tech. And it was, without a doubt, despite the howling winds and rain, the smoothest landing ever. So I came out and said, thank goodness, because this is a role in which, quote, AI, if you want to think of it as an extension, kept everybody on that plane safer than the human could. So we need to look past all of these short-term blips and bumps, be more assertive and excited about adoption. These are learning systems. The more they learn, the better they become. Let's talk about the important issues that underlie it. Job elimination, going to happen. How do we try and make sure that there's a good support system for those that are not reskillable and trainable? Good social discussion. Privacy of data, critical to tackle, but I don't think it's a reason not to proceed, etc. Right? So I'd like to argue in favor of, despite the limitations of the chatbots, I think these are things that we need around us, not for convenience, but because we have some really tough problems facing humanity.
Well, thanks very much, both of you, for a great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen.